Hello, and welcome to the fifth program in our series titled Reckoning, U.S. Presidents and Racial Inequality. I am Robin von Seldeneck with the Woodrow Wilson Presidential Library, and I will be serving as the moderator for this conversation. This series is made possible thanks to a generous funding from the National Endowment for the Humanities. And through this series, we explore individual presidents' views and political policies toward minority populations. We believe that these discussions among historians that include questions from the public are opportunities for honest conversation and reflection. Thus far, we have discussed Andrew Jackson, Abraham Lincoln, Ulysses S. Grant, and Rutherford B. Hayes. And this evening, we will be featuring Benjamin Harrison. If you are new to this series, I encourage you to visit presidentsandrace.org to view video recordings of our previous sessions. As usual, we will begin with a conversation with our panelists, followed by questions from the audience. We do want to hear from you, so please use the Q&A button on your screen to type in your question. At this time, I'm pleased to welcome four panelists from the Benjamin Harrison Presidential Site in Indianapolis, Indiana. First, we have President and CEO Charles A. Hyde. He has had successful tenures at Conner Prairie Living History Museum and the Indianapolis Zoo, building a reputation for innovative programs and engaging community partnerships. Since September 2014, he has served as the Benjamin Harrison Presidential Site as its president and CEO and led the organization forward as it has developed two successful five-year strategic plans, most recently in 2020, with an ambitious vision focused on innovation, inclusivity, and civic engagement. Jennifer Capps is the Vice President of Curatorship and Exhibition at the Benjamin Harrison Presidential Site. She has been at the site since 1990. Jennifer received her undergraduate degree from IUPUI with a major in history and a minor in anthropology. Her love of history started at an early age, and she has volunteered at local museums for many years. Jennifer has also served on several local organizational boards. Whitney Ball has over 13 years in the event industry and now runs the Event and Marketing Department at the Benjamin Harrison Presidential Site. Her initiative to bring more awareness and diversity to the Presidential Site has taken shape with the launch of the Juneteenth Foodways Festival, coupled with the exhibit, No Compact of Silence, Black Civil Rights Advocates in the Harrison Era. And also joining us this evening is Kelly Poston, the new Century Curatorial Fellow through the partnership with Indiana University Purdue University, Indianapolis's Museum Studies program. During her time, she helped curate a special exhibit, No Compact of Silence, Black Civil Rights Advocates in the Harrison Era, that highlights national and local advocates during President Harrison's term in office, such as Ida B. Wells, Frederick Douglass, Dolly Johnson, and more. Welcome to all of you.
Thank you, Robin.
Charles, I do want to start with you this evening and ask if you would give us a quick overview of who Benjamin Harrison was. He's often a president we don't know a whole lot about. So if you could share just a little bit of information.
Well, Robin, if I can back up and give a little bit of a wider view to begin with, and then I can share a little bit more about the 23rd president, Benjamin Harrison. You think about over the arc of American history, there have been approximately 500 million citizens. Of those, just over 12,000 actually served in Congress. I think with our newest justice of the Supreme Court, we'll be up to 116 who have been on the Supreme Court, but only 45 individuals and 46 administrations who have served as presidents of the United States. So 45 people out of nearly 500 million. So there's something exceptional about those 45 individuals. It might be good, it might be bad, more likely it's somewhere in between. But it really does speak to why conversations are important, to look back at our shared history and to better understand what the legacies of these presidents were and how we arrived at this moment today. Again, for good, bad, or somewhere in between. And I think that the story that Benjamin Harrison has to share is one that's especially relevant to conversations that we're having today. I would say among presidents, he's probably one of the most underknown, might be a good way to put it. So as 23rd president, he's the only president elected from the state of Indiana. His grandfather, who in many ways might be better known, is the one that only made it 1 month in office. So William Henry Harrison. And Benjamin Harrison's great-grandfather was a signer of the Declaration of Independence, so Benjamin Harrison V. So there's this tremendous civic legacy that I think follows the Harrison family through American history. And Benjamin Harrison definitely felt the weight of that obligation, recognizing that as citizens, we both have rights and responsibilities. And I think that you can see that sense of duty really shine clear in his attempts to meet the obligations he saw that he had as a president of the United States. And Jennifer will be able to share, I think, some finer detail related to his early life and what led him to the presidency. But I think certainly for the purposes of today's conversation, some of the themes that we'll be hitting upon will be that greater legacy that he had. Certainly thinking about conservation, being a strong advocate for the Forest Reserve Act, making sure that the presidents had powers to protect natural resources nationally. So that was one of the legacy items from his administration. He also called for and signed the Sherman Antitrust Act. So that came about during his administration. He actually hired 2 future presidents into his administration. So Theodore Roosevelt and Taft had their first federal jobs under Harrison. And of course, Harrison's strong advocacy for Black civil rights. So those are some of the things that really define Harrison's presidency. And I know that we'll be able to get into a little bit more deeply just in the course of our conversation tonight. But Jennifer, do you want to speak a little bit more to Harrison's story and how he found himself in the executive mansion?
Sure. Well, I'll go back to his childhood story that connects to, again, his sort of the beginning of his civil rights views. And it was that growing up in North Bend, Ohio, which is just between Cincinnati and the Indiana state line down there by the Ohio River, he, as a young boy, actually encountered a freedom seeker or a fugitive slave that was trying to escape to freedom. And they kind of locked eyes and saw each other and, didn't really say anything. But Harrison later remembered that they kept each other's secret. So that kind of goes to his views on civil rights and African-American rights and, setting that tone kind of for things to come yet in his presidency later as well. And I think so many of those things, again, Charlie mentioned the conservation, just all of the different efforts, again, that Harrison had. So one of the things early on, actually in his 1889 annual message to Congress, Harrison actually asked, when and under what conditions is the Black man to have a free ballot? When is he, in fact, to have those full civil rights, which have so long been his in law? Because, of course, after the Civil War, amendments were passed giving them Black men the right to vote. But really, then that wasn't what was happening, especially in the South. And looking at the different poll taxes and the different grandfather clauses that they were using at that time that were keeping Black citizens from casting their vote. So, Harrison is asking that early in his administration in his first annual message to Congress as well. And, coming to the White House, actually, he's one of the few presidents who did not win the popular vote, he won the Electoral College vote. But some look at that voting suppression in 1888 and in 1892 when Harrison ran again. You actually have historians, Dr. George Sinclair and Dr. Charles Calhoun, that have argued, especially for his loss in 1892, that Black vote suppression really did impact Harrison's not winning the election and in 1892 as well. And just a couple of other things that I'll mention that were during Harrison's administration that tie into our conversation tonight was the Lodge Bill of 1890, or the Federal Election Bill, again also known as the Lodge or the Forced Lodge Bill, was put forward by Henry Cabot Lodge. But Harrison did support that. But unfortunately, this was a federal election bill that would have helped protect some of those voting rights that they were trying to pass in 1890. But just unfortunately in Congress, of course, then that did not pass. But Harrison certainly was supporting that at the time. Harrison also supported anti-lynching laws, unfortunately, that did not pass as well. So you can see this sort of reoccurring theme with Harrison, is he is a proponent for all of these measures that he is trying to help as he can through Congress. Some, might think what more could have happened, what more could have been done at that time. But Harrison is certainly a proponent for these measures at that time as well.
And I do think it's interesting. You mentioned Henry Cabot Lodge, and I know there are quite a few on this evening who follow a lot of our Woodrow Wilson programs. And yes, this is the same Henry Cabot Lodge who was maybe, could we say he's the nemesis of Woodrow Wilson and with the League of Nations vote. So that is the one and the same individual. One thing that I thought was quite interesting in reading a little bit about Benjamin Harrison was his Presbyterian upbringing. And it seemed to really just shape so many of his thoughts and ideas. And Jennifer, would you mind sharing a little bit about that? Because it seems like he was very involved with the church his entire life, correct?
He was both Benjamin Harrison and his wife, Caroline Harrison, were very involved in the Presbyterian church their entire lives, and especially here in Indianapolis after they moved here to Indianapolis in the 1850s. They're moving here as a young married couple, so church was very important to them. And he served as a church elder through the years, and Caroline also taught Sunday school and those sorts of things. So that certainly was definitely, again, an influence for him. And I think, the Harrison family background, if you look at it, you have roots in Virginia. But Caroline's family, you have her father, Dr. Scott, who was also very involved in the Presbyterian Church, was a minister, but he was also an educator. And you see, I think, some of his influence as well, and some of his points of view in like Miami University and the things in the Presbyterian Church during that Civil War time that were happening, that they were kind of having a split in the Presbyterian Church during the 1860s over the issue of slavery. So that certainly impacted Harrison as well, and Caroline, as they were thinking about that. And serving in the Civil War for Harrison was very, very important. He preferred the title of general, it is said, because he risked so much more to earn that title than actually being called President Harrison. And so he really felt, again, strongly, and kind of that difference between like looking at the Whig Party at the time and states' rights, that the issues of slavery and the Civil War were definitely tied to his efforts, and why he felt it was very important to serve and to raise the 70th Volunteer Infantry from Indiana, and then lead the 70th Volunteer Infantry as well. And actually, that's how he got his a title as general at one of the battles in northern Georgia. So was obviously very influential in his life and very important to him as well.
Well, and Robin, just to expand on that a little bit, it's important to understand. You look at a presidency, and you try to understand it both in the context of its time in relation to the president who is, has agency within his own presidency. So, are decisions made cynically? Are they, holding true to lifelong beliefs? And I think it's relevant looking at Benjamin Harrison in the 1850s is well documented, with very strong views against slavery. And I mean, that's an even more interesting kind of narrative arc looking at his own family history. So his great-grandfather was a governor of Virginia, was a slaveholder. So within a few generations to go from slaveholding Virginian with his great-grandfather, certainly the history of William Henry Harrison is very controversial as governor of the Indiana Territory, and controversies swirling around that and slavery and whether that was to be allowed or abolished in the Indiana Territory. But then, within those few generations to have Benjamin Harrison in the 1850s being outspoken, and his advocacy for the abolishment of slavery, for him to be a volunteer soldier in the American Civil War, for the Union cause, as Jennifer noted, rising from second lieutenant at the beginning of the war, raising a regiment of 1,000 troops, volunteer troops, and then being breveted as a brigadier general by Abraham Lincoln. And it's certainly one of the treasures of our collection. We have a nationally significant collection of over 10,000 artifacts, but I'd say one of my favorites is that commission signed by Abraham Lincoln just shortly before his assassination, breveting Benjamin Harrison as brigadier general, I think for his valor in battle, and standing behind those beliefs that he sincerely held.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's really, I'm grappling with the right word to say here. I don't know if I want to say it's not refreshing, but I mean, so many of the presidents that we have talked about up until this time, we've really had to question what their real thoughts were dealing with African Americans, and the question of what happened after slavery, and how we welcome them as full citizens into our country. And it's not lost on me and many of us that had that Lodge Bill passed, what could have been so different about our country, right? Because I guess it was not until Lyndon Johnson in 1965 that we really have anything come about from that. And so we were kind of in a time of just being lost and having to fight these horrible battles that continue to go on even today in society.
Well, and Robin, very much to your point, thinking about what might have been, for that vote, I believe it came one vote shy of passage. Mm-hmm. And so again, trying to understand what more could have been done in that era. Could Harrison have better applied his moral authority, his legislative heft? He did serve as a senator from Indiana in 1880. And so there's further track record of his belief and his voting on bills through that service. But of course, there's always that what if.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Exactly. And I do want to turn to both Kelly and Whitney. I know you both worked on the current exhibit that you have. And Kelly, do you want to start by sharing a little bit about that? I know that was part of your work as a curatorial fellow. And then Whitney, if you would add on what the work that you've been doing with that to support that exhibit as well.
Sure, of course. So this exhibit idea was formulated in August, and it ended up opening in January of this year. So the panelists you're looking at here, we were on the committee of deciding on what this next special exhibit was going to be. And we pulled the title from a really great letter that Benjamin Harrison's writing back to Whitelaw Reid, who would have been his running partner in the second election, where Whitelaw Reid's asking Harrison about the Southern question, which was referred to for the Black voting suppression that was happening in the Southern states. And Harrison writes back and says, "I would not be willing myself to purchase the presidency for a compact of silence upon this question." So the title of this special exhibit is "No Compact of Silence, Black Civil Rights Advocates in the Harrison Era." And this special exhibit focuses, yes, of course, on the foundational portion of proposing an anti-lynching law, supporting the Lodge Bill, appointing 3 Black gentlemen into office. But the exhibit focuses more on the Black civil rights advocates and what they were doing in that time and afterwards. And it was extremely important that there was a president in that time saying, "I support all of these movements." So we focus on nationally known figures like Frederick Douglass and Ida B. Wells, but more so local Indianapolis and Indiana advocates. So you bring in people all from the Midwest as well. So we have Dolly Johnson, which Whitney will talk about in a little bit. She was the first Black woman executive chef in the White House. And then we have people like Major Taylor. So we see that advocacy from an athlete's point of view of everything he had to endure, and then later writing his autobiography about everything that was happening in that time. And then we focus on appointments. So Frederick Douglass was appointed by Benjamin Harrison to be the Consul General and Minister of Haiti. But we also have a local Hoosier, William D. McCoy, who was the Consul General and Minister of Liberia. And then Harrison also appointed Blanche Kelso Bruce to be the Recorder of Deeds for DC. So we have a lot of letters back and forth between those men. But then we shift things over to looking at public educators that were happening here in Indiana. So we have people like Sally Stewart, who helped form a lot of organizations like the National Association of Colored Women, as well as a lot of journalists that were happening in the time in Indianapolis, because that was a really great way for African Americans to get their words and their movements out there. So we're looking at people like George P. Stewart, who started the Indianapolis Recorder, and Lillian Thomas Fox, where she was the first Black woman to write for a predominantly white newspaper here in Indiana. And from that, we're just seeing all these great organizations popping up, with IWLs helping the NAACP, as well as Lillian Thomas Fox creating the Women's Improvement Club. So we really, even though there's those darker themes of white mob violence, lynching, Black voting suppression, this exhibit really celebrates their lives and achievements. Even when there weren't federal laws instating all these things, on a lower level, all of these people are doing such incredible things, and their names need to be learned and known. And this exhibit's extremely meaningful for people to walk in, and the first thing you see is a panel that's asking, what does it mean to be a Black civil rights advocate? And what can you be doing? Taking that focused look of when you leave the exhibit thinking, why are these things happening back in the 1890s, and what does it look like in current day? Just so people are continuously thinking about what was happening then and why is it still happening now, and what can you do to be a great Black civil rights advocate.
Yeah, and the beautiful thing, to Kelly's point, all of this came so natural you'll see articles that Frederick Douglass was a part of speaking about how important it was to vote for Harrison for the second term. And you'll see that advocacy from them. So it speaks a lot to him as a president. As he was taking these meetings, he was respected and also giving the respect, which was very important. And Kelly's wonderful work with the exhibit just kept evolving because of what we were finding from the initial research that she did, and the partners and the people that President Harrison was in contact with, and where that came from, and how it looks similar to what's going on today, the advocates and people that are advocating now. It's almost like taking a step back in time, but also realizing how important it is to be civically engaged now and then, and what you can do. It's also giving you the framework to know what you can do to be heard and to make an impact. So I think that the exhibit shows all of that and more. And Kelly mentioned Dolly Johnson, with her being the executive White House chef. We were so excited. We've known about Dolly for years, but we've been able to dig in a little bit deeper with her, knowing that she cooked for several different presidents, but also was hired by Harrison during his administration, and then went on to be a business owner in Lexington, Kentucky. That spurred some excitement with us to celebrate our Juneteenth Food Waste Festival taking place June 17th. We're inviting some wonderful Black-owned businesses, restaurants, and even more, and paying them to come and recreate some Dolly Johnson menu items, but also showcase their own food here out on our presidential lawn. And I'll say, being able to spread the word about Dolly, and then additionally adding into people coming to see the exhibit and learning more about other advocates locally and nationally that they would not have known about or did know and wanted to know more. We're just so excited to be able to present that to the community. And with that being so authentic, with that relationship with Dolly and Frederick and a lot of other advocates during that era, it's just been so fun to unfold and show, you know, I think a president, he did a lot, good and bad, however you want to look at it, but you see what impact he made on certain individuals, and just think about how a mountain of Frederick Douglass is when you think about history, and for this this gentleman to advocate for Benjamin Harrison, it blew me away when I found out. So I think it's just seeing the exhibit and seeing more after that is just so impactful for everyone.
Well, Whitney, you gave me a segue here because you were saying, you know, the impact that he had on the African-American community. And as we were all talking the other day, we were talking about it's not an either or, but a both and, as Christina Shutt at Abraham Lincoln presidential site often says. And so I do want to circle back a little bit to Benjamin Harrison and his relationship with Indigenous peoples. The Battle of Wounded Knee was I guess the last battle that we had with the Native American population, and a lot of times I think it's often said that the American frontier ends with Benjamin Harrison. But looking at the Battle of Wounded Knee, we see once again an individual within Benjamin Harrison who you know, you see does such great things on one hand, and then you're left questioning, okay, what's going on here? So I'm wondering if someone would be willing to talk a little bit about that battle, and then maybe what Harrison's response was. That would be wonderful. And I'm just going to turn that over to whomever wants to answer that.
Yeah, I can speak to that to some degree. And I think that we're seeking to be very intentional and understanding these stories and delving into the history more deeply. It was really important for us with No Compact of Silence, Black civil rights advocates in the Harrison era, to really not just look at it through the lens of just what Harrison was doing, but what kind of environment he was able to help create within that administration. So certainly the special exhibit does that. And I really want to commend Kelly and Jennifer, you know, mentoring Kelly, and it really is just a tremendous exploration of that era and that story of Black civil rights in that time period. I would say organizationally, we're trying to get a better grasp right now, and we're looking for partners that can help us better understand Benjamin Harrison and his relation to Native peoples. I imagine, you know, through the course of your conversations with other organizations and presidents and exploring their stories more deeply. The sad truth is that, you know, the American presidency in relation to Native peoples has largely been a story of woe over the better part of 2 centuries, and certainly even further back in American history. And so really trying to understand the decisions that they were making, and even if they were intended in good faith, the profound negative consequences that they may have had. And you cite a great example with Wounded Knee, where, you know, Harrison, you know, if you look at his papers, and I would encourage anyone that's looking to delve into this story more deeply to go to primary sources, and to also look to historians to better understand the context here. And that's true certainly with Harrison in relation to Native peoples. And you know, one of the things that we alluded to but didn't talk in greater depth about was Harrison and Dr. George Sinclair, and the article that he wrote on Benjamin Harrison and the Matter of Race. Dr. Sinclair actually wrote a book that explored more fully the legacies of, I think it's close to a dozen presidents and their relation to race. So it appears that what Dr. Sinclair did was, after writing his chapter on Benjamin Harrison and exploring his relation to Native peoples and to immigration, and then Black civil rights, he wrote a fuller article on just Harrison and Black civil rights. So I'd encourage, certainly for any of your viewers or audience that are joining us tonight, I believe it'll be in your resources page. That article, it's about 20-25 pages, but it's a fascinating read. So Dr. George Sinclair, again, was an African-American historian, writing actually this article in 1969, another time in our country's history of great, I think, intellectual foment, just trying to understand, grappling with some very big questions. And so Sinclair also, again, as I alluded to, does talk about Harrison and relation to Native peoples. And it's just something that requires deeper study and exploration. It appears, from what we can tell, that Harrison, after hearing about Wounded Knee, demanded answers from the officers in charge for what had happened, and justifying the excessive use of force that was made against the Native peoples. There's no question it was a massacre. So one of those great tragedies of American history, and one would hope could have been fully avoided had better policy been in place. But we've been combing more carefully through the Library of Congress and their recently digitized papers, looking at more of that correspondence and trying to understand. And I know that will inform a future exhibit, much like No Compact of Silence, where we're exploring that story more deeply and really trying to make sure, it's certainly a story that we can share here at the Benjamin Harrison Presidential Site, but we're actively looking for partners that can help us delve into that story more deeply, especially among representatives of Native peoples. Again, recognizing that there's a larger story to share here, and that there are a number of perspectives that will come into play as we're delving into this really complicated and tragic story.
And I think, to Charlie's point too, we're also looking to listen and learn a lot more than, we can look at the perspective from Harrison and letters and other political people, but we actually need to sit there and listen and learn more about what the Indigenous population has to say about it, what they know about it, so that we can get their perspective. So, like Charlie said, we've been in talks about this and trying to come about this the correct way, and we look to do that soon.
And I appreciate you saying that. I think that is, it makes so much sense to do it that way. I mean, coming from an organization that represents a president who had very strong segregationist views, but on the other end, when we look at how he was such a champion for the Jewish population, and so we, often really struggle with, how do you deal with someone who was so forward thinking in so many ways for some individuals, but then for other individuals did not see it the same. And when we look back at, I think there's been a theme as we've gone through the last series, this series in the last few sessions. Often it looks like what we see with Native Americans and the indigenous population is that the expectation is that they must become Christian and they must assimilate into who the white Eurocentric view of the country. And it just seems to be that theme that we see throughout there. I do know, I believe it was immigration, I think increased about 5 million in Benjamin Harrison's time. Sorry about that. And I do believe also Ellis Island opened at that time. So we're seeing a lot of immigration for the first time under Harrison. And I'm going to I see we have a question here I do want to ask because it kind of feeds into that a little bit. And it says, can you speak to the Italian riots in New Orleans and how they affected his decision to commemorate Columbus Day to appease the Italian Americans? Did he receive any feedback from the indigenous population on that decision? So that's a great question that one of our viewers has asked.
You know, Jennifer and I have had a number of conversations about this, and it's interesting because Columbus Day, of course, is so controversial today, especially in the context of Indigenous peoples. And when you look at Harrison's motivation behind the creation of Columbus Day, it was really seeking to counter a different type of prejudice that existed at the time against immigrants. So much to your point, there was lynching of Italian citizens in New Orleans. And of course, the Italian government was, hugely distressed about this. And Harrison acknowledged fully that, that reparations were due for those deaths. And so that's what the United States government did. It actually made reparations to Italy for the death of those Italian citizens. But I think Harrison also then sought, with the creation of Columbus Day, as a way to highlight our commonalities. And I think that you can see that that's a consistent story through Harrison's 4-year administration. Is, he came from the crucible of the Civil War. He saw the enormous decisiveness. He fought in those battles, and it's mind-blowing for me. I've been with the Benjamin Harrison Presidential Site now for almost 8 years, and so it's given me some time to reflect upon some of the decisions that Harrison would have made. And of course, trying to think of why would a president do this thing in certain ways. So imagining just about 20 years outside of the American Civil War, you had a president. So I'm thinking about, 20 years, actually, 23 years? That's the year 2000. That feels all of a sudden so immediate to me. And to imagine trying to govern with people, seeing them across the aisle, and maybe you were on a battlefield firing weapons at each other. Maybe they killed your friends, your family members, and to try to govern when it's not just the abstraction of potential violence against each other, but literal violence against each other. And so it explains why Harrison did certain things, like he took a 10,000-mile train trip, the trip to Unify, as it was called, traveling through the country, really trying to emphasize, instead of state-based identity, which accounted, I think, for a lot of the fractiousness of the Civil War, with states seceding, this idea that it was state first and then nation second. Harrison wanted to supplant that with this idea of country first, and that our state identities were important but shouldn't define us. And so what he sought to do is he sought to uplift the commonality piece. So you look at Columbus Day, he was trying to emphasize the commonality of the founding idea. And he was a lawyer by training. He was a deeply faith-based individual, and he believed deeply in justice through law. And so this idea of our commonalities and being able to come together and celebrate, and by extension to honor other immigrants that had shaped our country, I think by extension, it wasn't accidental. He really wanted to make sure that this idea of immigration was front and center in a positive way. And so I think that side of Columbus Day has been lost in a lot of the conversations that we're having now, instead focusing on the depredations of Columbus and subsequently that immigration to the New World and its profound impact on Indigenous peoples. So it's certainly a question that we all should be having today. I think it's certainly the right, if not the responsibility, of every generation to choose its own heroes. And it's important for us to be thoughtful about, as we're looking at those people that have been celebrated from previous generations, to understand what they have to contribute to conversations that we're having now. It's certainly where we seek to be very intentional as a presidential organization. I know that much in the same way, Robin, that you are, and many of our presidential site and library peers are seeking to, as one of our colleagues said, are seeking to humanize, not lionize these individuals. Jennifer, I don't know what you might want to add to that. Robin, I probably exceeded my a lot of time period.
No, that's great. That's great.
Question.
Yes, Jennifer, if you have anything, I'd love to.
Well, and I just think, going back to, again, Harrison's appreciation for law and looking at immigration a little bit more too. Again, he was known as being very thorough in his law career and, doing lots of research. And, if it was something that he didn't know, he would really delve into finding all of that information. So he certainly was, very mindful of what was like fair and just in that law aspect. And with Ellis Island opening, there they found actually there was a little bit of corruption, I'll say, at Castle Garden, and he wanted to make sure all of that was fair and everyone was processed equally and had a better facility. So they have Ellis Island that opens during the Harrison's administration, and you see all kinds of different immigrants during that time period. It's actually amazing to me. We have a photograph album book in our collection that actually one of the barge officials did, and just the variety of immigrants that you might not think about in 1890 that are coming through the doors there at Ellis Island. And again, Harrison felt that was very important. And I think going back to his family roots and his great-grandfather being a signer of the Declaration of Independence, and felt that strong connection to being a constitutional lawyer and really respecting kind of how we had our start as a country, and that we were a country of immigrants as well, and kind of continuing that along as well. I'll just add, this is off kind of our current subject, but kind of along those lines of the photo album and kind of circling back a little bit to Kelly and the exhibit. I think, again, it speaks to the Harrison family and to Benjamin Harrison. We are very lucky that the Harrisons saved a lot of things. We have a lot of original items in our collection. So looking at these items that tie into these subject matters, the photo album of Ellis Island that was presented to him and that he kept, and kind of going back to the exhibit as well, we have a couple of different photographs of Harrison with Frederick Douglass at events. There's an 1892 Republican nomination photo, the committee that for the nomination, and Frederick Douglass is also in that. And there are some other African-American gentlemen that are actually in that particular photograph from the Republican Party. And we have kind of a list of names from reports of that time period. And actually, Kelly and I are looking at trying to identify everyone in that photograph. So, but the fact that the Harrisons saved these things, saved the photographs, saved the books, we have books, in his collection again that tie back into these themes. We have books for anti-slavery and different stories that some were presented to him as gifts while he was president, but he kept those, he treasured them. We still have them in our collection. So I think that just, again, speaks to how important he felt these things were as they were presented to him. And kind of going also back to his Ellis Island and love of country, you have the centennial, he's the centennial president 100 years after George Washington. So the flag was very important to Benjamin Harrison as well. He was so impressed by the display for that centennial celebration in New York for the inauguration of George Washington that he had a proclamation to fly the flag over, schools and public buildings. So again, we have all of these wonderful stories, these wonderful connections, these wonderful artifacts. So we're very lucky in that respect. Also to be able to tie all of that into our story as well.
Well, and Robin, if I can add too, there's a lot of intentionality for organizations, museums, as they're seeking to better understand and share these stories. And it speaks to our efforts with the creation, and it's a great credit to Jennifer with the creation of the New Century Curator initiative. It was started because we recognized we had this nationally significant collection of over 10,000 artifacts. And we knew that it told more than just Benjamin Harrison's story. So we wanted to make sure that we were opening up that treasure trove of American history that is largely, underknown, for fresh eyes to help us understand these stories and to tell them better. So with that New Century Curator Initiative, we've had a series of really phenomenal exhibits that have delved more deeply into our collection. One of my favorites is New Women of the Harrison Era, and really looking at the powerful stories of three women whose lives intersected with Benjamin Harrison in some really compelling ways. So Belva Lockwood was the first woman to run for president and receive votes, ran against Benjamin Harrison in 1888. Frances Benjamin Johnson, who is the first White House photographer. The Harrisons gave her entree to the White House. A lot of those iconic photos from the Harrisons administration all the way through like the Roosevelts and into the Tafts and so on were taken by Frances Benjamin Johnson. And then Nancy Clem, who was actually the first woman to be charged and convicted of murder in Indiana, and Benjamin Harrison prosecuted as a lawyer here in Indiana. So there are these really compelling stories that speak to these presidential legacies in a very authentic way. And it's where I want to commend Jennifer and Kelly and Whitney. I mean, I think about Dolly Johnson and, you know, the fact that the Harrisons fired their White House chef and hired a Black chef from Kentucky. And, you know, she went on to, you know, open her own businesses, actually made national news when she died. There are really compelling stories to share here. And it's not always just about the presidents that we represent, but it's giving them greater context by sharing the wider view of their own eras and how they speak to that story.
Mm-hmm. And I love the fact that a whole generation of people are going to be hearing the name Dolly Johnson and seeing the example of the recipes that she left and being able to taste that. I just think that's such a wonderful way of taking this person from the past and being able to explore and honor that individual today. So I think that's just such a wonderful idea that you're going with in that series. I do want to ask a question. It's sort of been answered, but I do want to give you a little more time if you want to further expand. Can you share any impressions that Benjamin Harrison had from seeing the impacts of slavery firsthand during the Civil War and his campaigns in the South? And also, what do you think were his strengths and his blind spots as both a person and a leader?
If I might jump in first, full transparency here, Harrison was criticized as being cold and aloof. One of the nicknames for him was the human iceberg. So that's not the kind of nickname that you really want. I think Harrison tried to model himself, off of George Washington, just with being fair and impartial. And what worked well for the first president maybe didn't work so well for the 23rd. And just in terms of his time in Washington. But I think it's really impressive when you look at the record of accomplishment. Historian James Madison has said that, or suggested that Benjamin Harrison is one of the most progressive presidents of the 19th century, just with the astounding array of legislation that he was able to put forward and successfully pass during the first 2 years of his administration, with the exception of some of the prominent legislation that we discussed earlier that would have given greater protections for Black voting rights. Actually, he put forward legislation that also would have funded education at a federal level for Black children, especially in the South. But looking at those respective strengths and weaknesses, I think that he approached the presidency with a real sense of duty. So again, recognizing that as citizens, we have rights and responsibilities, and that presidents are as bound, if not more bound, by the law and following to the very letter of the law. And I think that probably limited him in some things that he would have liked to have done, but felt like he didn't have the constitutional basis to achieve. It's interesting, looking at his post-presidency role and how he continued to influence public opinion post-presidency. So he refused to rerun for election in 1896, deferring to McKinley. But after he had lost that election of 1892, he actually was invited to come and lecture at the new university in California, Stanford, and help bring that to national attention through a series of lectures that he gave on constitutional law. He also went on to write a series of articles for the Ladies' Home Journal on explaining the mechanics of the federal government, so that if women were to get the right to vote, they would have a full understanding of the mechanics of operations of our American system of self-government. That actually went on to be compiled into a book called This Country of Ours, that in terms of, I'd say that the full book maybe has aged a bit, but the preface and the introduction are really powerful yet today.
I would just add, looking at the Civil War kind of question and how that impacted him, it definitely, being involved in battle, he actually had to step in and be a sergeant at one point. So, we have letters that he writes home to Caroline Harrison and, kind of hey, if something happens to me, I, think of you, I'm thinking of you and the children kind of letters that you might expect, during wartime. So certainly made a big impact on him. And you see that carried through again through his presidency. So I don't know if this is like kind of a plus and minus for him as well, because Civil War pensions were very important to him at that time. And that, of course, increased the amount of government spending that happened during Benjamin Harrison's administration. But it was very, very important to him to have those Civil War pensions. He was very involved in the GAR, the Grand Army of the Republic, in his later years as well. So that was something, again, that the rest of his life that sort of stayed with him as well.
Okay. I had heard years ago, and I couldn't sing, you wouldn't want me to sing it even if I tried, Benjamin Harrison's campaign song. Is it Benjamin Harrison, He's All Right? Is that?
Yes, he's all right. He can wear his grandfather's hat, I think, is the line there too.
Okay.
And it's what's the matter with Harrison? He's all right. That the hat fits kind of thing. And with that ties the quarterback into Civil War, because Harrison, of course, served. There's a line, I think, in that song alluding to the fact that Grover Cleveland hired a substitute.
Yes, that's what I thought, because he really was wanting to make the point that Cleveland didn't serve, and he did, and that very much affected his outlook on things. So I'm sorry, Charlie, go ahead.
I was just going to say, and certainly Whitney and Kelly may have some additional thoughts on this, but to answer your earlier question more specifically, I think one of the most moving things that I've read written by Harrison, or I guess technically spoken by Harrison, he was extremely articulate. He was known for his front porch campaign in 1888, given right here from the front stoop of his house in Indianapolis. It certainly brought Indianapolis and Indiana to national attention in a way that had never before happened. But that speech that he gave to 300 individuals who called themselves the Harrison Club, so 300 African-American men. And it was on that occasion that he told the story that Jennifer had shared earlier about finding a freedom seeker, a fugitive slave in the canebrake, and promising to keep his secret. It's just so profoundly moving to think about being confronted with a situation like that in a time of fugitive slave laws and the consequences of not abiding by those. Harrison here is on the Ohio River, just across a river literally from slave states, but that he chose to keep his secret, I think says a lot about at least who Harrison was a person, and certainly what he sought to be as the president.
Mm-hmm.
And I think to Charlie's point too, we talk about just things that framed him as a president and what framed his policies. And I think I was talking to a volunteer around earlier this year on President's Day, actually, and she mentioned that First Lady Caroline Harrison and President Harrison met through her father, where I think he was tutoring or tutored. You guys can please correct me if I'm wrong, Jennifer and Charlie, but her father had been fired because he was he was anti-slavery and very vocal about that. And, you know, that also gave me a whole nother perspective. He not only had the story that he told those gentlemen from the front porch, but he also, you know, obviously honored and respected Caroline's father, and things that we probably don't even know, different instances that he had other influences. But I think that was really a phenomenal story, or even just a perspective of what framed him and framed his mind to be where he ended up being in his presidency and beyond.
Yeah, that was Dr. Scott, Caroline's father, and he taught at Farmers College, where Harrison actually was a student, and then went to Miami University, Miami of Ohio, and actually started the Oxford Female Institute there in Ohio as well, where Caroline attended. So there was kind of that split, I'll say again, with the Presbyterian Church and with Miami University, kind of that split along those lines during that Civil War time period.
Yeah, it's interesting hearing the similarities of what was happening with Harrison with Woodrow Wilson and his father, who was raised in Ohio pre-Civil War, ends up being pro-South and is the first chaplain for the Confederate Presbyterian Church. And so it's just an interesting, a thought of how all of this all connects.
It's also about who you surround yourself with, and you look at presidents now and previously, who are you surrounding yourself with? They're in your ear, and
That's right.
I think that's important to note. Like, he was spending time with people that were actually walking the walk and talking the talk with Frederick Douglass and other people like that. I know that, no president is perfect. Lots of flaws, just like every other human. But it's really nice to be able to advocate and share this story, because it's so important, and for people to understand. I think sometimes they get shocked. I know I find that talking to people and telling them what's going on, they're like, wait, what? So it's really exciting to be able to share that and kind of add some shock and awe, and teach them about the 23rd president.
Great. Well, I have one final question for you, and that is, and we've touched on it this evening, of the way our field has changed so quickly. The museum field is just, it's like, hold on tight. Things are changing so fast. So what have been the biggest changes that you have seen in your tenure at the Harrison site? And I'm going to start with Jennifer, because I know she's been there the longest, but I'm going to, I want everyone to kind of to share, because I think it speaks volumes of where the forward thinking and where the site is going.
I say, of course, every presidential site, the president that you represent, you always look at his accomplishments. And again, we are privileged and lucky that Harrison does have so many positive. Again, no one is perfect. There are always those things where you're like, oh, that could have gone a little better. But I think that through the years, just the way, we've looked at his connection to Frederick Douglass. We've looked at his connection to the Forest Lodge Bill. But just as the last even, 10, 15 years, as we've progressed and doing exhibits all those different years and times, the amount of resources, it's, as technology change, things are easier to get to. Sometimes you have the whole Library of Congress, all of Benjamin Harrison papers are digitized and actually up online. You still have to kind of find what you're looking for. But I think we are at this point in time then kind of re-examining some of those and looking at those subject matters. And again, we want to be very mindful. And I think this, again, speaks to Harrison as being known for, I'll say, being very truthful and very true to himself, that we are representing things very factually. So, it's the good, the bad, and the ugly all rolled into one if necessary, and that we're just looking at these different items with a new lens and kind of getting more details. So where we've maybe looked at those connections again in the past 10, 15 years ago, we have a lot more detail. We're finding a lot more, like Kelly did with this exhibit that just opened this year. I just think it's amazing, like those, especially for us, those local Indiana and local Indianapolis connections. There are names that I never have heard of, and there are people that Harrison interacted with, but just kind of those resources that are available to search help you get a little bit further than maybe you did a few years ago. So again, we'll be looking at these things, looking at the Native American issues as well. When we just, again, are very truthful and don't want to in any way misrepresent what actually took place during Harrison's time period as well.
Well, and to add to that, Robin, I think it's important for us as we're trying to better understand these stories, as Whitney alluded to earlier, that we want to have good partners, that we want to better understand how we can share these stories to be able to approach it in an authentic way. It's one of the reasons we're so excited with the Juneteenth Foodways Festival that we have 23 community partners that are helping us share this story authentically and in a way that helps shine a spotlight on a really important aspect of American history, even as we're seeking to understand, appreciate, and celebrate those contributions today. So being able to do so, again, in a very authentic, honest way.
Yeah, and I think what I find that's changing is being able to share those stories, but also I love the virtual aspect. So people who wouldn't normally get a glimpse or hear from our president and CEO and our curator, I think that's what's really important to us. We have Coffee with the Curator every Friday, first Friday of the month online, and seeing that far-reaching impact is super important for us, especially in a time where things are shifting, not only being caught up with the current events and kind of trying to match what we're doing to that, but also having that online presence and getting people who can't come here but can see a little bit here and there. And that's what we're also very excited about. It's fun to be able to see who's watching and from where, and being able to join you all too is really special.
And Kelly, we want to hear from you too.
It's been a really awesome experience as a soon-to-be museum professional as I graduate here in May. It's really wonderful to see an institution like the Benjamin Harrison Presidential Site making such a strong push for DEAI, so diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion. And the most important thing I think in the museum field right now as we progress is just starting the conversations. It's okay to not know where you're headed or what's going on, but it's starting those conversations, trusting in yourself and the integrity of your institution to make this change and to keep it going. So I know there's a bright future ahead for the presidential site.
Okay, I lied. There is a great question that's here, and I have to ask because Brian always has the best questions, and that is, what has been the reaction to the most recent exhibit?
If you don't mind, I can speak to that. We had an especially large amount of coverage for this exhibit. And like I said, it's kind of a shock and awe of, wait, we didn't know this was, part of Harrison's legacy, but with Kelly and Jennifer's amazing work, a lot of people have come. We've seen people come just for the exhibit, not just to do a tour, and then they end up getting a tour. So that's, we've had some really great feedback. We had some wonderful community partners come out and experience the exhibit. And I think, it speaks to, and I can't say this enough, I know how hard Kelly and Jennifer worked on this exhibit, and it was wonderful seeing it take shape. But it just speaks on how heavy and informative it is and how wonderfully researched it was. But we had such great feedback, and people were excited to continue this until November. So if anybody has a chance to pop up here and see it, it's well worth it. But for events this summer and beyond, we'll be able to share this with the community, and that's what we're most excited about.
Great. Thank you so much. So as we end this evening's program, I do encourage everyone to go to the website presidentsandrace.org. That's all one word. And there you'll find excellent in-depth resources about Harrison, the information that Charlie had shared during the conversation this evening. It's all there. You can also view recordings from previous sessions in the series. I do want to let everyone know that next month this program does continue. We will be having a conversation on President Theodore Roosevelt, and that will feature scholar, author, and educator Clay Jenkinson of the Theodore Roosevelt Center in North Dakota. That program will be held on Thursday, June 9th at 7 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Central, and you will once again go to presidentsandраce.org to register. So Charles, Whitney, Jennifer, Kelly, thank you all so much for sharing your time this evening with us. I also want to thank our attendees and viewers, and we look forward to seeing everyone next month. And on behalf of all of us at the Woodrow Wilson Presidential Library, I hope you have a wonderful evening. Thank you so much.